All right, today we're going to get under the hood of the Indian government to take a look at its engine room, the executive. This is the branch that takes all the plans and actually puts them into action, the part that makes the country run. So, let's figure out who's really got their hands on the controls.
You'd think that's a simple question, right? But, the answer is way more complicated than it looks. I mean, we see the politicians on TV all the time, but they're just one piece of this huge machine. So who's actually in the driver's seat? Okay, so before we dive any deeper, let's get one thing straight. The executive, well, their job isn't to make the laws. That's for the legislator. The executive's job is to, well, execute them. They're the ones who turn all that policy talk into actual, real-world action. They're the doers.
All right, let's break down this whole machinery of power. And to do that, we've got to understand the specific model India uses to run its government.
So, think about a system like the one in the USA. The president is pretty much the undisputed boss, right? But in India's parliamentary system, things are different. Power is split. We have a president who is the formal head of state, sure, but the real day-to-day power, that's with the prime minister. And this is the crucial part. It means the government is directly answerable to parliament. That completely changes the whole power dynamic. In this executive branch, it's really got two arms. First, you've got the political executive. These are the folks we elect. The prime minister, the cabinet ministers, they're the ones setting the big picture direction, and they're accountable to us, the people. But then there's the other arm, the permanent executive. This is the bureaucracy, the civil servants. They're the ones who handle all the day-to-day stuff, and importantly, they provide that stability and continuity when governments change.
So let's talk about the president's power. It's so easy to just write them off as a ceremonial figurehead, right? But is that really the whole story?
Yeah, I mean, that's what most people think. The president shows up, signs some bills, goes to a few ceremonies, basically just does what the prime minister and the cabinet advise. Just a rubber stamp, right? Well, not quite. And this is where things get really interesting. See, when a bill lands on the president's desk, the Constitution gives them a few options. They can sign it, sure. They can send it back and say, hey, maybe think about this again. Or they can just do nothing. And believe it or not, doing nothing can be one of the most powerful moves of all.
There's actually a perfect real-world example of this. Back in 1986, this super controversial bill landed on President Gianni Zal Singh's desk. Critics were saying it was a huge threat to press freedom. Now, what did he do? He didn't sign it, but he didn't reject it either. He just held onto it, tucked it away. This became famous as the pocket veto. By the time a new government came into power, the whole political mood had changed, and that bill, it just faded away, never becoming law.
And let's be clear, this wasn't just him forgetting about it. This was a decisive political move. It proved that when the situation is right, the president's greatest power isn't a pen to sign things, but a pocket to put them in. It shows the office is way more than just a ceremonial role.
Okay, so the political side of things can have all this high drama. But what about the actual machinery that keeps running every single day, no matter who's in charge? For that, we need to look at the other arm of the executive, the civil service.
So who are these folks? Well, they're the highly skilled administrators who get selected through these incredibly tough competitive exams, like the one run by the UPSC. The whole idea is that they are politically neutral. But here's a really interesting point. They're trained to be administrative generalists. That means an officer could be in the agriculture ministry one year and then find themselves in the defense ministry the next. The whole system is built to provide that rock-solid stability and continuity, bridging the gap between one government and the next. They really are the backbone of governance.
But, this giant machine isn't perfect. It has its challenges. The sheer size and complexity, the bureaucracy, all those rules and hierarchies, it can sometimes create this huge gap between them and the very people they're supposed to be serving. And that can lead to this feeling that they're a bit insensitive, where everyday people feel kind of intimidated by the system that's supposed to be there for them.
Okay, so now let's look at what happens when you put both of these arms together, when the political drive and the permanent machinery team up to make a really big decision. We're going to dive into a case study about a single government order that sent absolute shockwaves across the entire country.
And it all kicked off with just one piece of paper, an office memorandum. Now, this wasn't some law that was debated and passed in Parliament. Nope. This was an executive order. And what it did was finally put into action the recommendations from something called the Mondal Commission, which had been gathering dust for years.
And right at the core of that order was one single number, 27%. That's what it did. it reserved more than a quarter of all central government jobs for groups that were classified as socially and educationally backward classes, the SEBCs. Just that one decision kicked off one of the most intense, most heated, and most divisive debates in the history of modern India.
Almost overnight, the country was split right down the middle. On one side, you had supporters who said this was a desperately needed step for social justice, finally giving a fair shot to communities that had been held back for centuries. But on the other side, opponents were really worried. They feared it would actually make caste divisions worse, not better, and some even argued it could threaten the unity of the entire nation.
And this debate didn't just stay in the streets or newspapers. The order was challenged in court almost immediately. It sparked this massive legal battle that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The case, which is now famous, Indira Sawhney versus the Union of India, would basically decide just how far the executive's power could go on something this big. So in 1992, the Supreme Court finally gave its verdict, and they upheld the government's order, which was a huge confirmation of the executive's power. But they added a really important condition. They said the creamy layer, basically the wealthiest people within those backward classes, had to be excluded. This was to make sure the benefits actually got to the people who were most in need. It's just a perfect example of that constant dance between executive power and the courts keeping things in check.
So, after looking at all these key players and the kinds of power they have, we're left with one last really big question to think about.
I mean, just think about it for a second. Our ministers, they're political generalists, right? They're chosen because they can win elections and represent their constituents, not necessarily because they're a deep expert in, say, global finance or military strategy. And, like we just talked about, our top civil servants are also generalists, trained in the art of administration and move from one ministry to another over their careers.
And all of that leads to this final question. In today's world, which is getting more and more specialized, we're dealing with everything from AI to climate change, is a system that's built on generalists still the best way to govern a country as massive and as complex as India? It's definitely something to chew on. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.